Okay, as we're getting started, we're still waiting for some of our registrations to join our webinar, but I'll go ahead and welcome everyone to the On-Farm Solar PV training webinar series. As you're all familiar with at this point, this is number 8 of an ongoing series. This runs, has run weekly, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. Today's session is dealing with utility scale leasing. So we're kind of pivoting from what we've talked about previously, looking at smaller on-farm use of solar PV. We're going to pivot more towards these larger installations, multiple megawatts, 2 megawatts and up is what the Maryland Public Service Commission would consider a utility scale. So we're going to be talking about everything from the contract and lease clauses and some of the things that you want to look out for in considering the leasing of your land for a large scale installation. And we'll talk about some of the technical aspects as well. So we still have people joining our program today. I'll introduce myself. My name is Drew Chavone. I am an energy specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, working with the Maryland Energy Extension Program. My background is in agricultural engineering, working with energy conservation and clean energy technologies for agricultural operations. You can find out about some of our educational programming, this webinar series included, at our website. That's extension.umd.edu/energy. We do engage in educational efforts related to residential and commercial, and of course, agricultural energy as well. So there's a number of resources on our website if you want to find out more about that. We're also joined by Paul Geringer today. He is with the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics as a extension legal specialist with them. He has joined our program before. He specializes in ag law. He was able to join our previous session dealing with zoning and permitting, primarily for the smaller systems we've talked about, but he's back with us today. I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to add anything on your knowledge level, but he'll jump in just a moment, and we'll get into some of the content for today. As I mentioned, this is number 8 of the series. If you're interested in some of those previous topics that we've addressed, in particular, we talked about solar installation and maintenance, again, mostly at a small scale on-farm use. That recording and the slideshow that we shared is available on the Maryland Energy Extension website. So you can go on there and review that recording. We're going to kind of build off of that and look at utility scale today. As I mentioned, it's a lot of similarities what we've talked about before, but in terms of the installation and permitting, it's much larger scale, obviously. So we'll kind of build off of that and move forward with some of those topics. I'll mention a few logistics as we get started on the program today. I believe we do not have the Q&A feature today, so if you have questions, do not put those in the Q&A, put those into, there should be a chat function. So you should be looking for somewhere where the chat function is, put those questions in, and what we'll do is we'll hold off to those questions at the end of the session. So around before 2 o'clock, we'll try to get to those questions and answer those. I'll also mention that the session's being recorded, as each week we record these. So if you don't want your video or audio, make sure those remain muted and turn your video off, because this session will be recorded. As we get started, I'm going to, I think we're still having some people trickle in, but I'm going to launch our opening survey to give us an idea of who's joining the program today. So you'll have a minute or two to address those 3 questions. What industry are you from? Any specific applications of solar photovoltaics you might be interested in? I'm assuming we'll have a lot that are interested in utility scale, because that's our topic today. And the third question is any specific interests that you have in terms of the webinar. Please just take a moment to complete that survey, and then we'll jump into the core part of our program. And I'll pass it over to Paul Gehringer in just a moment. Okay, give about another 15 seconds or so if the last few folks could get their responses in. Okay, so I'm going to wrap the poll up. Thank you for responding to that survey. It helps us to know who's with us today. And I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to pass it over to our legal specialist, Paul, and he'll get started on some of these. The content that we'll start off with is looking at land use, a variety of environmental and economic concerns related to utility scale leasing. So Paul, you should have control of the slides if you want to test that out.
Let's test that real quick just to make for sure. I'll go back. Oh, let me click in the slide. Oh, it worked. Great. Okay, so thank you all for showing up this afternoon. We are going to talk a little bit about utility scale and some of the issues that will pop up with that. And I can do a little bit of a plug for a project I'm a part of at the very end of this. But looking at some of the land use issues, the first thing we need to talk about that I didn't include in the deck is really and truly when it comes down to the zoning and planning issues that we talked about during the small scale stuff, with a lot of the larger scale solar facilities that we're going to be looking at, they're going to deal with the zoning and planning when it comes to that. You're not going to have to worry about that. They're going to know what zoning and planning is, or should know what it is in your area if they're coming to look at your property as potentially a site that is suitable for these things. Now, they're also going to work to get all the permits. So there's probably going to have to be a stormwater management plan. There'll have to be other permits with the state that will go along with this. They're going to have to get a CPCN certificate of public necessity to develop this thing. They're going to work on all those permits. That's really not something you're typically going to have to involve yourself in. So that's the first thing you need to know. That's like, that is not on you, that's on them. They'll deal with everything that goes into that. You potentially want to include lease to see these permits just to verify that you have them in place as we talk about them. As it leases, you'll just want to make sure that you at least verify and you know that they exist and that you know they're on the up and up, but for the most part, these should exist. So if you have existing conservation contracts with either USDA or the state, you have EQIP on it, you have some state cost share dollars associated with it, that's the area where we're going to run into problems for landowners. You really do need to start talking to USDA, the state agency, whoever at this point, to make sure that whatever is going on the property, you can legally do this. Because if you've got EQIP and there's still life left on that property, you may not be able to do this at this point on that piece that you need, that they want to do it on. So we need to keep that in mind. And if you do go ahead with it and you are within that contract period, you may have to pay that money back. So you do need to check on that. And that is something we always try to get landowners to be aware of as this process goes along. And at some point, we're going to move on. So the other thing that could come up with this is your neighbors or you yourself may have concerns that these will impact property values in your area. Some people do not want to live next to this facility. They don't want to live next to wind turbines. They don't want to live next to a power plant, whatever it might be. There is some research out there, and I included this link in the slides, and I think you get a copy of the slides at the end, to a study that's recently come out of University of Rhode Island looking at this, and they found it does potentially lower property values by about 1.7%, from what they've seen. But you can kind of look at that and get a general sense. So there is some impact on property values. It's may not be high in some cases there, but it still is there, and neighbors may have these concerns about that in the long run. And then I think, Drew, it is now you.
Okay, great. Let me take the control back from you. Okay, so I will just try to take just a brief several minutes just to give an idea of what these types of projects look like. As I've mentioned previously, we've looked at, for smaller scale, the installation and maintenance in a previous session. So I'd recommend you review that if you're interested. This is very similar, obviously, just the economy of scale and the larger installation. It is more efficient as they go through with heavy equipment and more manpower, depending on the size of the system. And these go in pretty quick, but I wanted to give a kind of visual depiction of what it looks like. I'm not sure if I'll have time to play a video of an installation, but I'll show some of the details that go into it and kind of the rough timeline for it. So there's a number of aspects involved in the process, and I don't want us to get too caught up on the timeline here, 3 weeks, 1 week, that kind of thing. This really depends on the size and scale of the system and the type of equipment and everything else. And in particular, this timeline given on the presentation is for a smaller scale system, not necessarily a utility scale system anyway. But it highlights some of the different aspects, and I'll briefly just provide a couple comments on these and then share some visuals for it. But a lot of the time is eaten up in project evaluation, site evaluation, and that kind of aspect. And they'll look at your property and they'll do some behind the computer work, analyzing the site to see if it's a good fit for a solar installation. So a lot does happen in that early phase. The engineering design, of course, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about this and the due diligence with permitting and other applications, interconnection and other things that have to take place. But I'll point out the installation itself is kind of a smaller portion of this whole overall picture. I mean, there's a lot that goes into permitting and the design of the system. Installation goes pretty smoothly. And really, if you're thinking about, again, going back to the timeline of this is ideal. Oftentimes these installations and projects get caught up in legal issues and public hearings and things, and it can go back and forth for months or years. So again, don't get too caught up on the timeline. But once we get to the installation phase, a lot of the kind of logistical work is already done, and now it's just hitting the ground with the installation. And we'll look at what that looks like on site and look at some different examples of what it looks like on the land as that's going in. And then, of course, going into commissioning and the project starting. So a couple things I'll just point out, again, going back to the early phases, there's a lot involved in the site selection. And I don't want to get too much into the detail on this at this point, but they're an installer or a contractor is looking at a variety of things, both environmental aspects as well as location, grid proximity, how close are they to tie into the transmission and distribution grid? Are there neighboring properties around you that they'll have to set up arrangements with? If you have properties on the west and east side of your property, or in this case, there's water and sewer considerations, they're looking at all these factors to decide, are they going to have to clear the land? Is it forested, or is it cropland traditionally, or is it more marginal land use? They're going to have to look at some of these issues as part of the site selection. But again, a lot of this does happen behind the computer as well. They're going to use GIS, satellite imagery to look at and use soil survey databases and wetland databases to decide if it's a viable prospect to move forward. And they'll develop constraint maps just kind of highlighting some of those considerations and looking at what land is usable, what's not. It may not be that your entire parcel of land is available and feasible for an installation, but that'll just be based on a variety of factors that installer should be comfortable with exploring. The next step would be developing, the feasibility site plan, laying out kind of a basic idea of where different components of the system are going to be placed. And they need to have site access. They need to consider, are they going to have temporary roadways? Is it going to come in right off of the major scenic highway, or is it going to be more obstructed view? They'll start to look at those different aspects and how the whole system will kind of play together. And there might be some give and take and back and forth to kind of get things laid out on the site. But that's a lot of the pre-planning. And then based on that is getting into the site diligence, due diligence aspect, the different permitting aspects, both from an environmental and from a engineering standpoint. Part of that would be the interconnection request that they apply for the utility to connect to the grid with. As Paul mentioned, there is the CPCN, that stands for the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. So that's particularly related to these larger utility scale, 2 megawatts and up here in Maryland. You'll have to go to the Public Service Commission. I've included that website here. We've looked at it previously, but the link again is here to get more information on that form that has to be filled out and that process for going through that CPCN for the bigger scale systems. But there's a number of different permitting aspects that have to be a part of that. And really all of this is really where a lot of those soft costs are allocated. We looked at the financial aspect and breakdown of the systems in a previous week, maybe last week or the week before. But we looked at kind of the price breakdown of these different aspects. We haven't really even touched on the specific equipment that takes up some of the cost. But these soft costs, all the permitting and design work is a significant portion of the cost of the system. The engineer and the contractor, I mean, they design the site plan, lay out all the final electrical design work. All this has to go through the permitting process. The contractor should be familiar with that on a local level and understand what needs to get done to see this project move forward effectively. Now, I'll just take a quick minute to highlight some of the actual installation. And then this is where we get into some more of the hard costs and the actual equipment being installed on the site. Of course, it involves with, site preparation, if they have to clear any debris out of the way, if they have to do any grading or erosion work. But then the system actually goes in with posts or piers or piles, whatever kind of system you're installing. And again, we've looked at this in a previous session, more of the nuts and bolts, and I'm not going to get into the every detail here again, but there is that video if you want to go back and recap some of that. We're not seeing too many tilt brackets or anything like that, tilting mechanisms, but we'll take a look just momentarily at the mounting structures that actually support the modules. That's where the PV panels or the modules are actually sitting on top of those mounting structures. You have the DC wiring components, and this is just kind of as a review, but the DC wiring is on the module side of the inverter. That's the direct current that ties in with all of your power conditioning systems that then go into your AC transmission network. And so you have the AC lines typically trenched out and buried, so they're below ground, and that it eventually ties into substations and going out into the utility grid. So just to give you a quick overview of what some of these steps look like, site preparation, it can look different depending on the type of system and some of the specifics of the site. But you'll see, a lot of times the first thing to go in is some staging area where you put gravel or something in to protect the ground and erosion, and you're going to receive incoming equipment and supplies here before it goes out onto the specific site that it's been surveyed for. You'll have to remove debris or clear level ground where necessary. And then what you'll see in the bottom photographs is those piers being driven into the ground. So they're positioned in the field by a surveyor And then in this case, you see the heavy equipment coming in, driving or shaking those into the ground. In some cases, they're screwed into the ground, but those piers being put in place at the right orientation. Again, there can be a lot of trenching involved in the process. The racking goes in on top of those piers. We've seen some more details of this in previous sessions, but the racking work goes in on top of those piers. You know, in a lot of cases, this goes very quickly. Like I said earlier, a lot of the behind the scenes work, the permitting and other stuff takes up a lot of time, but the installation can go pretty quickly, especially with these racking systems. Some of these only take a few nuts and bolts to tie those together. What you'll see in this photograph in the center is a mounting bracket that holds the modules onto those that racking system. And then all the wiring run underneath below the modules. And that connects in with some easy connect systems running to, typically you'll have several rows of modules tied in with a single string inverter. And so you have string inverters then running into an AC distribution at the end of the row. So you'll have AC distribution and the transmission lines coming off of that, typically going into a transformer that will step the voltage up to a higher voltage level. From that transformer, you'll go into a substation and tie in with the utility line. And they'll typically, you know, bury most of this AC transmission underground. And so that's kind of out of sight. So that's what some of the system looks like. Again, every site and project will be a little bit different. But those are some of the aspects of it there. Of course, there's the commissioning and final check off and approval with permitting and everything that has to take place before the site's closed out and operational. As I said, I've included this video. It's actually on YouTube, put up there by Aurora Energy. I'm not advocating, we're not advocating for any particular company, but this is just one nice example. They put together a really nice video. I'm not going to attempt to play it in case I lose my signal doing so, but it's a nice video that shows the installation process. I've included the link and it'll be on the resources that we share on the website after our session today. This is a smaller system, only 200 kilowatts. It's not a utility scale, but it does demonstrate some of those aspects I just talked about. Up front, you'll see the staging area, not quite as robust as the examples I shared previously, but you'll see how that equipment is brought in and put in a staging area. Then it's brought into the field where they're starting to install the piers, dig trenches for AC lines and other aspects, and then the modules and racking system on top of all that. But it's a good time-lapse video, short video that you can review that I'll share at a later point on the website. And I'm sure there's plenty of other examples available on YouTube as well. But it's a good idea to kind of explore some of those things as well, looking at from a more technical standpoint on what you can expect on your land. And this could take a couple weeks to a couple months, depending on the type of system. But hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of what it looks like. And now at this point, I'll pass it back over to Paul to get into some more of the clauses and things that you'll see in the lease. So let me pass that back to you, Paul.
Okay.
You should now have control, and I'll let you kind of finish up.
Thanks, Drew. And I am gonna, oh. Yeah, so the first thing we really need to talk about is with property ownership. As we're looking at this, you may not always have the ability to lease your land like you think you ought to be able to lease it. As we move through this process, depending on the type of property ownership you have, will depend on who all else needs to sign off on this. And with the basic forms of property ownership, we have fee simple, which is the highest form of property ownership. It's where you own it by yourself. You don't have anyone else involved in it. You can do anything you want with the property, so you can easily sign a lease. That's not a problem. So you get to make all the decisions when it comes to solar leasing. Other forms we're going to talk about as we run through this briefly may not always have this right. So we're going to end up with some forms of co-ownership in here as well. We'll have tenants in common. joint tenants, and tenancy by the entirety. I can't remember all the states, but if folks on here are not in Maryland, more than likely tenancy by the entirety does not impact your life. All property in your state that's tenancy by the entirety is joint tenants, is a joint tenancy. So with all of these, you're going to want the solar company is going to want the co-owners to sign on. So in each one of these, you have some form of co-ownership in the property, and everyone's going to have to agree on it. With tenancy by the entirety, the big deal is it's formed between married couples, so both husband and wife, or whatever the relationship is in that situation. All the parties will have to sign off on it. Oh, and then the weird one is life estates. With life estates, we have this idea of a life tenant. They're the person who owns the property right now. And I put owns in quotes because they really don't own it. They have a more or less, not really a use right, but they do have a right to the property tied to their life typically. And at their death or the death of another person, whoever the life estate is tied to, it will go to a remainder man. Both of those parties are going to have to sign off on it. So if the life tenant doesn't want it, but the remainder man does, the remainder man has to wait until they get the property, whatever that flow is at that point. So it's not something always that's going to be easy, but property ownership is going to dictate a lot of this. And we do need to pay attention to how this is going to apply. For the most part, this shouldn't be a problem, but it is something worth paying attention to with deeds and stuff as to who can make these decisions and who can't. The other thing we have to think about in all this too is a lot of property in Maryland and in other states may have conservation easements existing on it. If you're considering a conservation easement on the property, solar may not be a compatible use at that point. It will depend on who is taking the easement as to how compatible it will be. On farm, that's probably not a problem. When we get to utility scale, that's where the problem is. We have disputes ongoing in the state as to how much solar we're going to allow on ag land and when does ag land lose its character once we put solar on it. These are things that are still being debated and it's sometimes hard to figure out. So this is something where if you're thinking about it, solar may not be a compatible use because you may not be able to get an easement on the property. The same being said, if there's an easement already on the property, it may not be a compatible use. The easement holder may not allow it to happen. Some will, others will not. For the most part, whoever is the easement holder, check with them to see what will be allowable under it. It's hard to kind of give general advice because different land preservation methods may allow it. The Maryland Ag Land Preservation will allow it up to a certain point, but won't after a certain point. So it's something we're checking on just to make sure. If you're going to consider an easement in the future, check with land preservation just to make sure that you can still be accepted and how much solar can be put on the property before you get taken out. You may not be able to put that piece of property with the panels on it in easement, especially if it's utility scale. So future uses. These agreements are probably going to limit your ability to use the property how you want to, where the panels are at and within certain distance from the panels. The developer wants access to sunlight. They don't want you shading these things. Shading these things takes away the monetary value that they are looking for out of it. And if you screw it up from what Drew's shown in development, site development, and all that, it screws up what they've done. So they're going to limit a lot of what you can do in the property. You may also have to go in and take trees out. You may not be able to plant trees in certain areas that you need it. Again, that goes back to why you should check with USDA in the state to make sure if you had cost share money to plant trees or do something else, you're outside the contract period because trees may have to come down. You may not be able to put new buildings up. You may not be able to do other things just on that piece of property because you put panels on there. That's something we have to think about in this process because we will be limiting what we can do with it. The other thing we need to think about is what do the future owners want to do of this property, especially if we're looking at it being able to be passed on in a farm succession plan at some point. We do need to think about all of these things. that could be going on and what they would want to do. We need to sit down and talk with them. I know talking with your family is really hard and nobody likes to do it. I mean, I have to talk to mine on the phone from time to time, and that is just a pain to do sometimes and figure out what people want. I hope everyone gets I'm trying to be funny with this. But you know, the solar lease is going to limit what the next generation can do, and we need to make sure it's compatible with what they want to do too. They may have plans for the property that may include some different ag enterprise that may require development of new buildings on the property or something that you may not be considering at this point. And we do need to think about that and how that will be compatible with the addition of panels on the property. So now what you all want to hear about. So what are some of the typical lease clauses that will come on, and you'll have to be thinking about it? Well, the first thing I always want to point out to people in this situation is you almost always want to develop a team. You should not go into this situation on your own. You need professionals that can help you think about this. You're going to want to talk to an attorney because this is a very complex legal document. I see one of my co-project people on a project I'm a part of, we're looking at these leases to try to figure out what we can do to help provide information to landowners to be able to understand these documents better, because they are so complicated, and get attorneys trained to be able to handle them in some cases. You really do want an attorney to review this and think about what you want to do. You want an accountant to help you look at it, because you know the lease payments are going to come in and that may change some tax situations, and you want the accountant to help you understand that. You may want to talk to your insurance carrier to make sure that whatever you put on and whatever is put on still is compatible with what you're doing with your insurance carrier and your insurance coverage. You know, you got to talk to your family, especially if we're looking at passing it on to the next generation and what they want to do. Your lender may want to be involved in this process as well. You may want them to talk to them just so they understand what you're doing and what this will do to the operation, because it will potentially be bringing new money in, but it may be limiting income sources in other areas that you need to work with them on. There may be others involved in this. You can talk to extension people about it. You can talk to others who you feel comfortable with bringing in and you think should be a part of this, depending on what it was. You may want to have your own engineer come in and just make sure the site picked is the best site and everything's going to work out properly and not cause you problems. It just depends on what type of person you are and what type of information you want in this process. So there are a lot of areas we can get into and what these agreements are going to look like. More than likely, there'll be some form of this in the process. There probably will be something, maybe a letter of intent that just simply shows they want to develop the property that they sign with you. It may be very simple in terms. It may not limit anything. We may end up seeing a much larger document that includes an option to lease that includes all the terms in it. It gives the company time to go through that process Drew has talked about. So they'll go out and do all their site checks to make sure this site's actually going to work and figure out what can be done. The other document that may come into play in all this is a solar lease. It may be one document signed at the end. It may be signed early on, and each one of these is a part of it. It just depends on the company and what they're doing as to what type of document will be used. So it just will depend. Not all these situations are the same. And there are things we do need to think about in all of this, because if we are going off with a solar lease that includes a letter of intent, an option, and solar lease, we do need to have somebody help us review that early on. But if it's just a letter of intent and then we go through the process and we're signing different documents along the way, we may not have to get the lawyer involved till much later in the process. So pay attention to how long these things will run. From what we've seen in at least some initial reviews, they're probably going to run about 20 to 25 years. There have been some that have run 50. This may include, some of the development stages that Drew talked about, giving them time frames to get stuff done, from determination to construction to operations, and then cleanup. We'll talk about what needs to be done in cleanup here in a second, because you do need to think about that in the lease as well. But this lease may include all of these. So we do need to think about that and keep them to the time frame specified. If not, there may be some legal ramifications that come through if they don't. If we look at it, what I've seen put in presentations for wind energy initially, some of these may have been just on paper appear to be like a 20 or 25-year lease, but they included renewal provisions that extended them 100 to 150 years. So pay attention to renewals in all of this as well. You don't want to get stuck with a lease that's going to continue on for, very long. Potentially, you may want the ability to renegotiate these things from time to time. So you want to pay attention to that. I know in Western Maryland, especially with oil and gas leases, some people got stuck with long renewal periods in their lease and had limited ability to sign leases at one point. So it is something that can come back to hurt people if they don't pay attention to that. Yeah. Pay attention to the renewals, as I just said. Make sure you understand what they can be triggered for, when they can be. We're seeing that from most of the documents I've seen, we're seeing that more limited than what was seen in the wind industry very early on. So it's probably not the 150 year renewal up to, but we need to pay attention it may be up to 50 years, and that may still have some implications down the road. Other things to think about in all this are, more than likely it's going to contain a confidentiality clause. And this is to prevent you from discussing the terms with other parties. Now, that's not always means you have to go into this by yourself. It means what you need to do is you have some limited parties you can talk to. Typically under these, you can talk to your accountant, your team, who's ever on your team that's providing you advice. Those are the people that you don't have to worry about the confidentiality clause with. They're going to be bound by it too, so you can at least discuss it with them. The other thing is, these things can be broad and they can be narrow. They may be broad to just limit it to data collected during some of the option periods, but they may cover the entire agreement. Most of the time they cover the entire agreement, but you still need to pay attention to that, just because if it is in there, you may not be able to talk to your neighbors about what your rental rate is. And that's the area where a lot of people want to know, because they want to know, we all want to basically either get the same thing or slightly better than our neighbors. So you will want to go talk to your neighbors and discuss what you're getting. So maybe you can get something better out of the company, what they got. This is one way to prevent that and keep you out of the dark. These things work on information symmetry at some point, and this is a way to keep it to where you have less information than the other party, and you may be getting a worse deal than other people, but for the most part, they're probably offering you all the same thing. Now, if you all team up together and you go in and negotiate together, the confidentiality clause at that point applies to the joint agreement, not just your individual agreements. And there are ways around this. And if you want more information, we can talk later. The other thing to think about is, how much rent are you going to get paid in all of this? With solar panels, it is almost always set up on a per acre or per dollar per acre value. It is almost never, and pretty limited, that I have seen royalty clauses in these where you would get a percentage of the energy produced, or the money off the energy produced off the panels that you would see sometimes in oil and gas leases and wind leases. I have talked to attorneys in other states who have said the only type of lease they would have their client sign is a royalty one. And we had an energy economist here at one point who did some work on that, and he could not ever figure out how to get them to pay out above whatever the minimum rental rate was in the lease. So that may not be a winning strategy with these. It may be just looking to see if you can maximize rental payment per acre, but we don't know yet. Commonly, you'll get a lower price during the development phase and higher in the operations phase. That makes sense, just because during development, they're not bringing money in and they're just sort of paying you for the right to hold the land. During the operations phase, they're actually producing and making money. So typically they would want to increase that payment to you to hopefully entice you. And these are things that with the automatic renewals, we would at least want to see where you would get some ability to tie this to some level of inflation, so your rental payment would go up. In a lot of leases, they are to where they escalate over 20 years by a certain amount each year. For the most part, they're almost always going to retain a right to assign the lease, sublease it to some other party, or just sell the property to some other property. It's pretty standard in almost all the leases, but it will almost always be there. But something to think about, because you may not start the lease off with the same party that you will end the lease with. It may trade hands over the years. This can be done without your consent or with it, depending on the language in the lease. Almost always when I've seen them, it's almost always without your consent. So let's talk about the end of this thing. What happens when we have to remediate the site? Typically, there needs to be some language in the lease that says what will happen to it. I do point out that currently Maryland requires during the CPCN process that the company get a bond to cover these costs. But it's probably still good practice for you to lay out how that's going to be done in your lease, because you don't want to get stuck with them remediating the property to what they think it should be, but it doesn't meet your standards. So you want to, if they're taking trees down, you're going to want trees replaced when the site's returned to normal. If they're, you're going to want it returned to whatever category it was at the very start. So you may want to make it very clear how you want it renewed and how you want it remediated. The bond stuff that's in the process does help, but it would be better to at least clarify how you want a lot of this done. The other things to think about that a lot of people sometimes don't think about is the property values may increase once the facilities are built, because now they have this new use on them that may increase the value. You want to specify in the lease that whatever increases in the value of the property is that can be attributed to the facility. The solar panels goes to the solar company and you're not on the hook for that. I've seen leases where that's not done initially and the landowner gets stuck with a tax bill in the end. Status of tax liability may change. If you put enough panels on this thing, you may lose ag land tax assessment. You want to check with the assessment to make sure this is still going to be ag land tax, because my guess is the solar company's going to want to keep ag land tax. They're not going to want to pay the higher bill, and you're going to want to keep it too, because once this goes away, you're going to want to keep ag land. You can get it back in, but you want to make sure that it's at least maintaining it in some way. So do check with tax assessment offices to make sure you're going to stay in the process. And I need to go over. We've already talked about this with some of the future stuff, so I just want to reiterate it. It is one of the biggest issues that comes up with these leases is think about what you want to do in the future, because you may be giving up your right to be able to do some of this just based on the number of panels that are coming on the property. You may be limited in height, structure, everything because of this. It's not something people normally think about. They think, well, without this, I can still do stuff way over here, but that may be causing a problem with the panels and you may not be able to. It happens too with other energy development that could go on the property with either wind turbines or oil and gas. They don't want development within so far the facility because it could screw things up for them down the road. And there may be zoning and planning issues that they just don't want you within a certain number of feet just to maintain zoning and planning, like they said they would when they got the permits from the state. And I think we're ready for questions, unless.
I think so. I'm going to take control. And if you do have questions, remember to get those into the chat box. So as you're getting those into the chat box, I'm going to pull up our final survey and then ask for your input on this final survey before we close out, and we'll get into your questions. But you should see 3 questions appear on your screen, looking at what you knew before you participated in this webinar today. Question 2, have you learned anything? Hopefully you have, and you haven't become more ignorant of the issue, but hopefully you've gained some knowledge in that. And question 3 is if you plan on taking any actions. And again, we're not telling you to take any actions. Hopefully we've given you some tools to make informed decisions in this area. But if you plan on taking any actions, touching base with an installer or a contractor or anything else, let us know. And that'll help us. And additionally, if we're not able to answer questions today, and you want to reach out to us separately, you can do that as well. But I'm going to give a couple minutes while we're doing that, while we're still getting those questions in. I'm going to pull the chat feature up just to see what questions we've had come in. We'll go forward with that. So waiting on a couple more responses, and I'll close that survey out and we'll get into the questions. As we're doing that, I'll just point out again, this is part 8 of our webinar series. So we're actually going to take next week off for Thanksgiving holiday, but we'll come back the first week of December. We'll have a session, actually our final session, on battery storage, integrating batteries with a solar PV system. And we'll kind of go back into the smaller scale systems. We're not going to talk much more about the utility scale, but on December 2nd, that final session is going to look at on-farm PV systems coupled with battery storage. So if you have not registered for that final session, please do that. We'll continue with some related programming going into the new year. We're not sure exactly how it will be framed, whether it be all virtual or if we'll have more in-person training, but we'll have some of that. So if you're interested in that and more information, reach out to us directly. My contact information is provided here, or you can go to our website, the extension.umd.edu/energy, and you can find out about upcoming programming in this area if you want more information. But with that said, I think we've got the responses that we're going to get back on this poll. So I'm going to close that out and I'll jump over to the questions that we've had. Okay, so our first question here, and I think this should be visible to everyone if everyone has that. We have a resource posted by Corey Ramsden, a good webinar on landowners' perspective of solar leases. I'm not sure if that's, it looks like it's from Pennsylvania State.
I think I've watched that one. It's good. They do a good job with that one.
Okay, so good. So that link is in there, and I can duplicate that as well. When we post these resources on there, I can link to that on our website and review that. The comment here is that most of it was applicable for other states, so probably applicable here in Maryland as well. The SCIA and New York, NYSERDA have land lease guides that cover lots of topics. So there's some good links in there. Again, I'll copy these over and post those into onto our Energy Extension website as well. Have another question here. Okay, comments on the gifts, Paul. So you're getting some comments on that.
They drive my students nuts.
Yeah, I enjoyed seeing that. It kept me awake. Not that your presentation was boring, but I'm an engineer and I don't work well with economics, so that kept me going at least. Here's a question as well. Are there any projects in Maryland that have remained under ag assessment? So I'm not familiar with that, but you have any...
I'm not 100% sure, and that's actually an issue I'm trying to get someone at the state to help me work through to figure out sort of what they would require, what would have to happen before it came out of ag use and how much. So that is an area that I'm looking at right now for Cheryl with our solar project that we currently have ongoing.
Sure. Question, if will both be available as resources as ag, as landowners decide to move forward with these utility scale leases. I don't know, from my personal standpoint, I don't know how valuable of a tool or asset I could be in terms of evaluating leases. That's not my expertise. Paul, I don't know if you want to comment on this. I can talk from a technical standpoint on that to some extent and guide folks as an extension specialist, but I do have capacity in what I can engage in.
I can do it. There are limitations on what all I can do, but I can do it. I can't tell them to sign it or not and tell them how to negotiate it, but I can at least tell them what the terms mean and attorneys they should talk to help negotiate the lease better, but I'm happy to do it, Maureen.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that goes into some of the resources you talked about, talking with an attorney and a financial advisor and those other parties. and us in extension, we can serve to the extent that our roles enable. But I think going with those other parties that are critical to this discussion are important as well. That said, I'm not seeing any other questions. Maybe we'll just give one more minute or so. If you do have questions, again, you can reach out to us individually. My contact information, my name is Drew Chabone. My email and phone number are provided there. You can get our information on the extension, UMD extension website as well. Paul's got his contact information in the chat box, so you can reach out to him as well. Let's see. I thought there was more questions. That looks like it. But again, reach out to us if you have questions, and you can contact us at any point and follow up on this. The recording for this program will be posted in a day or two on the website, and I'll include some of those links as well for the Penn State program that they had on leases, and some of those other resources will go up there. So again, I want to thank everyone for participating in our webinar. I hope you gained something from this, and hopefully we'll see you back in December for our final session. So we'll sign off there. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.